Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Tarek Kettleson. I'm the director of the Australia-Mekong Partnership for Environmental Resources and Energy Systems, known by our acronym AMPERS, and invite everybody to take their virtual seats and get ready for a real and interesting discussion. For those who are coming from an electrical engineering background, amperes is the current that we use to measure the flow of electricity. And my important job today is related to that flow. So my role would be to guide everybody through the different sessions as we go through today, and to discuss a little, to take on a bit of a role to kind of summarize the findings at the end. So we should have, we have about 160 people in the room today, and we should have in total, we have about 430 people who have signed up, with a pretty good split actually between government, private sector and civil society, and a really high representation from our three focal countries, Indonesia, Vietnam and Philippines. So we're really looking forward to a discussion and a deep dive into those three countries, but also to think more broadly at the regional context with Thailand and other countries in ASEAN. There's a few housekeeping notes that we should take care of before we start. First off, that this event will be recorded. So we are recording the event, that we will make the video available on YouTube. This is one of our very public-facing events in the Energy Transition Roundtables, and we're really looking forward for wide participation in the event and a wide sharing of the discussion after the event to influence the debate on and the discussion on energy transition. The second point is that we have interpretation into a number of different languages today. You can choose English, Vietnamese, Indonesian and Thai, and you'll see in the Zoom function there is a button at the bottom where you can click on that, and you can choose which of those languages you want to listen in on. So please make sure you pick the language that you need as from that menu below. Next point is about questions. So we have a Q&A button at the bottom of the screen as well, and you can see that with a kind of two speech bubbles, Q&A. That is a spot that you are welcome to ask questions at any time. So please, as you're listening, add your questions into that Q&A chat, and we have a number of people kind of monitoring that and who will direct those questions to the moderators, and the moderators will then help to ask those questions. Of course, as a dialogue, we also encourage people to ask questions directly. And if you feel comfortable to do so, what you can do is you can raise your hand, and there's a button again in the Zoom tab at the bottom there for raise hand. And when you raise your hand, you'll be given access to turn on your video and to ask the question directly. So if you would like to speak directly, please do and raise your hand, and we can do it that way. Last thing, the presentations that we've got will be shared with participants at the end, as will the YouTube channel link. So you'll be able to see all of the material. So no need to, if you want to kind of rush and take screenshots or take notes or whatever, you'll get all the materials at the end. Okay, I think that's all of the housekeeping things. I hope that's clear. Any questions you have that it's unclear, open the chat box, and you can send a chat comment to me, and we'll ensure if there's any issues that we can help you sort those issues out. All right, so we got a couple of sessions to get through today in a short time frame, so I'm going to keep my interventions quite short so that we can give all of the excellent panelists and speakers and the excellent audience a chance to speak. So our first session is we'll have the opening remarks, and I would like to introduce first Professor Frank Yotso. So Frank is a professor at the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy, where he's the head of energy at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions. He's an environmental economist and an IPCC author, and he writes extensively on policy for climate change and for energy in the context of economic reform and development. So he's also the editor-in-chief for the journal Climate Policy. So without further ado, Frank, I pass over to you for some welcome remarks.
Thank you, Chair, and a warm welcome to all of our distinguished guests and participants and colleagues, of course. So the UNOPS Energy Transition Partnership Energy Transition Roundtables is a capacity building program in Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, led ultimately here by us at the Australian National University in close collaboration with AMPERS and, importantly, our partner organizations among the University of Indonesia, Universitas Indonesia, the Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonization, the Ateneo School of Government, and the University of San Carlos. Now, today's event is the first major outreach and engagement in the second year of operation of the program. A number of webinars, roundtables, and trainings last year have enabled a deep dialogue within countries and across the regions regarding that shared challenge of a rapid transition to clean energy. Now, today's today's sessions are on the role of governance and the role of markets in the Southeast Asian energy transition. And without further ado, I would like to invite Silva Javanpa, the Director of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership, to address the meeting.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Mr. Haris Yaya, Director of Geothermal Department of Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, Mr. Hang, Department Director General at the AREA, Electricity Renewable Energy Authority in Vietnam, Director Irma Esconde, Electric Power Industry Management Board, and Ms. Baltasar, Assistant Director at the EAPMB, Electric Power Industry Management Board. Babeni, Dimitri, Ms. Chai, Dr. Lloyd, hello to everyone, and good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for coming into this session. So many of you have come to contact with the Southeast Energy Transition Partnership, ETP. I wanted to just put an accent on our mission and partnership. As you know, ETP is a consortium of governments and philanthropic foundations. The governments include the UK, Germany, France, and Canada. And the foundations include Children's Investment Fund Foundation, Sequoia Climate Fund, IKEA Foundation, and others. This indeed, as Frank was saying, is one in a series of energy transition roundtables ETP has been funding with the support of the Australian National University and peers and the partner universities here in the region. This is the 22nd roundtable and the second of these grander regional energy transition dialogues. It's been really a fantastic journey to be part of this, and this event builds on the past 21 roundtables, which have been focused very closely on energy transition topics. The sessions have provided something like an executive MBA program for some 100 professionals that are active in the energy transition here in Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. There was also an executive training course included in the program, a series of deep dive sessions in each of the three countries, and preparatory dialogue on the issues that were covered at the COP27. So during these events, these roundtable discussions and other sessions, the two issues that Frank just highlighted have been constantly coming up, and they really here have a very excellent place to be the focal topics as we approach the very critical time milestones that have been agreed in the various declarations. So governance and market mechanisms are such central issues in energy transition process that this is a very good time to bring this up in a very focused and concerted way. So most of the Southeast Asian governments enhanced their nationally determined contributions toward the Paris climate target of 1.5 degrees at the COP27, and prior to that in COP26, everybody signed the Glasgow Compact, agreeing to lay out strategies and roadmaps to limit indeed the temperature increase and global warming. So in the context of these declared objectives that really rally and bring the stakeholder communities together behind a shared objective, these topics that we explore today, whole of government approaches that endeavor to make good on the commitments, and how market mechanisms play a role in these countries to be able to, in fact, translate the benefits of energy transition to the civil society, to energy resilience, and to energy security, deserve a session dedicated to these topics. So given the urgency for actioning the roadmaps for energy transition, and now the heightened commitment and ambition that stems from the UN declarations, JET-B declarations, as well as the enhanced NDCs, it's absolutely a perfect time for this discussion. And I'm so happy to hear that we have registration of more than 400 people. And in the room, I believe we have close to 200 people discussing these issues. Excuse me. So I'm really inviting everyone here to make full use of the session and the experts that will speak to you today. Let me just say 2 words about the program itself. It's a 2-year program and it's coming toward its end, and we are very much looking forward to our implementing partners, the National University, Australian National University, as well as Amperes and the local universities, to prepare something that we are calling a sustainability report. So how does practitioner level training get delivered in the region in the best way so that it really leaves long-lasting impacts and lessons in all of your minds? So that's a thought that I would like to also ask you all to think about, that how should we really continue a learning program like this? And I am sure that we will find ways to contact you to ask you for your opinions and suggestions going forward. So now, without further ado, I encourage all of you to take full advantage of the discussions today. Please do use the commentary buttons and issue some questions for the panelists. Thank you very much and good morning to all of you.
Thank you very much, Sirpa, and thank you, Professor Frank, as well. We are off to a very good flow, and I appreciate the welcome from both of you. So on the screen now, you can see very quickly the agenda, and you can see we have the two sessions, the 2 issues, as Frank and Sirpa mentioned, the governance and the markets, the role of markets. Each session is structured the same, so we'll have some keynote presentation, 1 or 2, depending on the session. We'll have a chance for a panel discussion where our panelists will have a chance to kind of respond and contribute a bit of flavor and to the keynotes. And then we'll have the Q&A discussion. So please ask your questions. As you think of the question, ask them, put your hand up or put your question directly into the chat at any time that you have them. And we will ensure that those questions start to get discussed as much as we can in that Q&A session that we've got at the end of each of the sessions there. We have dedicated a significant time for Q&A, so we hope there is plenty of time for everyone to ask questions. And then at the end, we'll have a closing session where we'll synthesize what was discussed and some closing remarks as well. So with that, let us move on to the first session. And this one is, as Sirpa mentioned, something that has definitely come up a lot in our discussions in our previous roundtables that we've organized in the past 18 months. And this is the role of governance. So we want to focus on and try and understand what is the status of governance of the energy sector in Southeast Asia, especially in our 3 countries, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. And what do we do if we want to meet those targets, as Sirpa mentioned, those ambitious and important COP targets that countries are now subscribing to? What do we need to do in terms of reform to enable that kind of success and that kind of a progress? So that's really the focus of our discussion today. And we are very pleased and very lucky to have a keynote presentation from Pak Benny Suryadi. Pak Benny is from the ASEAN Center for Energy, and ASEAN Center for Energy has has in recent years really established itself as a thought leader on energy and energy transition in the ASEAN and ASEAN states. And Pak Benny is the manager for power, fossil fuels, alternative energy, and storage at the Center for Energy. He has more than 12 years, so a very rich experience dedicated to managing programs and conducting research on energy and climate change. And he has worked with governments in all of the 10 ASEAN countries, with the ASEAN Ministers of Energy meeting, the MEM, and worked extensively to build climate-friendly development of the energy sector, as well as lead energy partnerships with multiple governments and international development agencies. So Pak Benny, we're very lucky to have you here. And we'll pass over to you now for your keynote presentation.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Tarek. That's going to be for the lovely introduction. Good morning, Sirpa, and also Prof. Frank Jetso. Warm greeting to everyone from Jakarta. Thank you very much for the ETP, for the ANU, Empress, and all of the organizing team for having me in this important discussion. And as introduced, I'm working for the ASEAN Center for Energy, an intergovernmental organization that represents the interests of the 10 countries in the Southeast Asia region for the energy cooperation. And part of our work deals with the governance of renewable energy, as we are supporting the region to achieve its renewable energy target of 23% in the energy mix by 2025. Hence, I'm really thankful for being invited and share the finding from our recent paper, the ASEAN Energy Transition, how to attract more investment in renewable energy, jointly written with Dr. Roman Fakulchuk and Dr. Indra Overland from the Norwegian Institute for the International Affairs as part of our collaboration under the ASEAN Climate Change and Energy Projects. Next slide, please, to the slide 4. Yeah, as of last year, maybe statistics today, the ASEAN is the 5th largest economy in the world. The combined GDP of the 10 countries in this region amounting to around $3.2 trillion. And ASEAN itself has been one of the most attractive global investment destination for the last 10 years. The total foreign direct investment, or FDI, in ASEAN rose from annual average only around $37 billion in 2015-2017, doubled to $74 billion in 2018 until 2020. And by 2020, that's the official renewable energy policy of the ASEAN countries were already more favorable than those of the most other region in the world. But then, despite this development, despite the falling cost of renewable energy globally that we hear every single day, but the fact is the region still considered as one of the world's lowest development rates for the renewable energy, both in terms of the investment attracted to the sector and also electricity generation capacity. Next slide, please. To reach the 23% target, based on our previous study with between ACE and IRENA, the ASEAN will need to attract investment around $27 billion in renewable energy generation and infrastructure every year from 2016 to 2025, or around a total of the $290 billion, or equal to around 1% of the region's GDP. But then, as we can see on the data that we have, investment in 2018 total is only $7 billion. So it's only a quarter of the amount required. Such a limited investment in renewable will make reaching the ASEAN target of the 23% renewable difficult by 2025. In some years, investment growth has been slow, in the chart, stagnant, or even decreasing in some ASEAN member states. Some countries, allow me to few names of it, like Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and Thailand, experienced a negative investment trend from 2017 to 2018. So this is the main background of this study that we conducted, trying to understand why, despite the positive rhetoric, ASEAN has largely failed to attract significant investment in renewable energy since the signing of the Paris Agreement. And of course, need to address that how can renewable energy governance and the business climate can be improved. Next slide, please. First, we start with the first issue, the legislation. As ASEAN, we are dealing most with the policy makers. Last year, most of the ASEAN countries have adopted renewable energy regulatory practice on based on the best practice that we adopted from many places in the world. All of the ASEAN countries have official renewable energy target already, and most of it already included their renewable energy target in their national determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. We also see that 5 top ASEAN performers like Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines that adopted most of the possible policy measures already, and there has been a progressing across the region. So why, for example, why has there not been more investment, for example, Indonesia, if much of the legislation is already in place? The main reason that we identified from this study is a weak implementation and enforcement of the regulatory policies and fiscal incentive due to the weak governance and institution. The enabling policy across the ASEAN countries are considered weak, or to some countries is non-existent. Often, investors do not consider the legislation that has been adopted to be a sufficient basis for investing, but they put greater emphasis on whether there are institutions capable of implementing the legislation effectively and consistently. So if the legislation is weakly implemented, attracting investors can be challenging, even when the costs fall to the level that should be, in principle, be attractive enough already. Next slide, please. So how about the governance structures? From this study, we also observe that with the partial exception on the hydropower, the ASEAN member states use mostly renewable as the only complement to the other energy source. Why? This is reflected in the governance structures. In most of the case, renewable energy policy is assigned to one or more smaller subunits that have limited autonomy and decision-making power, lack required personnel, and have limited resource at their disposal. And perhaps due to the inertia or limited resource, regulation governing fossil fuels are often copy-paste into renewable energy sectors. Although we all know that transition to renewable energy is more difficult if decision makers use the existing fossil fuel-based institution to govern renewable energy. But again, the question why? Earlier I mentioned that the ASEAN countries have limited capacity for renewable energy governance. We have the number $290 billion of investment required to meet the 23% ASEAN-wide renewable energy target, but that for infrastructure, that's not including the cost of the governance reform yet. What many people miss, building institution and capacity to support renewable energy also require substantial investment. That's why I'm very grateful that for the organization that, for the project that being run with the ETP and you, we really put a focus on how building the capacity, the institution to address this issue with more than hundreds people graduated from the MBA program. Next slide. So what should we do next? As we all know, the ASEAN countries have made progress, but again, we also know that not yet enough built institution to implement this policy. lack of the capacity, knowledge, and experience. So other possible low-hanging measures that can improve the renewable energy governance and overcome the carbon lock-in. From our studies, one solution that we thought could be good to consider is to create a resource pool with a high concentration of the human capital, knowledge, skill, and regulatory and controlling function all in one place. This could be achieved either through deep reform of the all fossil fuel ministry or by establishing new ministry for renewable energy. Australia, among other countries like Egypt, India, and myself, for example, they have prioritized renewable by creating autonomous government bodies that have formed a resource pool for renewable energy and have become powerful players over the times. Unlike establishing a small and marginal renewables department units, setting up large and autonomous ministries send a very strong and positive signal to the investor. Creating a new ministry implies deep institutional and structural change rather than only cosmetics. Setting up a new renewable energy ministry and assigning real power to its can be also a pragmatic and symbolic act that can attract the investor on the renewable energy. So next slide, please. In addition to designing and adopting sound policy and increasing the share of renewable energy in the governance system, it is also very critical to improve the investment climates and communication. Failure to communicate serious moves toward green energy make investment less attractive. Investors increasingly worry about the reputational loss or prioritizing market with a conditional favor for decarbonization. It's also increasingly evident that many copy-pasting policy, even the best practice, is not sufficient to attract investment. We are in the global race to attract the investment. So if the country in this region want to be a renewable energy investment winner, the countries need to address respond to the question: what is the value added in this international context? What can they offer to the investor that they cannot find elsewhere? Next slide to conclude. Based on our analysis, we propose 3 policy measures to attract more investment in renewable energy. We'd love to also hear the feedback from the panel's letters. First is the ASEAN member states, ASEAN countries to continue to adopt best practice policy and incentive and put them in practice. In particular, they need to strengthen their practical experience of managing tender, feed-in tariff, and auction. Second, each ASEAN country could create a ministry or similarly high-level governing body responsible for renewable energy. This will help build a human and institutional resource pool for renewables and increase the share of renewable energy in energy governance system. Such a body could be unbundling from the existing energy ministry to ensure greater autonomy, decision-making power, and expertise to obtain a better service for investors. Last but not least is ASEAN countries need to improve their position in the ranking of renewable energy investment climate. They should actively communicate their reform progress and share success story with the other countries and for the foreign investor. My next slide will be my last slide, just a reference to the paper that I presented. I personally recommended everyone to download and read our paper to learn more about the finding and suggestion. I shall stop here. Just the last word. So exciting to hear from Sirpa Ila about the output from this program, which I believe will be very crucial to support development of human resource to address the issue of governance on renewable energy in the ASEAN region. And also looking forward to read the sustainability report of this program. And then ACE is happy to take action also to leverage this to the policymakers and minister levels. Thank you very much for everyone's kind attention. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks very much, Pak Benny. A very interesting presentation there where we see the high investment in energy in ASEAN as a global, top global destination for energy, but not a low investment in renewables. And the way you've articulated the problem and some of those solutions should be very interesting for discussion. So let me now introduce for everybody the 4 panelists that we have for this session, and then also the moderator. So in terms of the panel, first we have Pak Harris, who is joining us. He's the Director for Geothermal at the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources. He has a strong background, both academic and in government, in electrical power and energy management. And Pak Harris has been a really active and important voice through the energy transition roundtable. So he's been in many of our events and has provided some great insight in those events. So welcome, Pak Harris. We also have joining us today from Vietnam, the Deputy Director General for the Electricity and Renewable Energy Authority under the Ministry of Industry and Trade in Vietnam. So this is, as in the vein of what Pak Benny was mentioning, a dedicated electricity and renewable energy authority set up by the government of Vietnam. And we're very pleased that the Deputy Director, Mr. Hung, has joined us. Before being appointed the Deputy Director of EREA, Mr. Hung has a PhD in engineering, and he was also the General Director of the Power Energy Consulting Joint Stock Company #1 and part of the Vietnam Electricity Corporation, so EVN as well. So he has some very practical and direct experience both in government, but also on the private sector side of things. So welcome, Dr. Hung. We also have, as we've heard this morning from Ms. Serpa. So Ms. Serpa, we didn't actually have a chance, but sorry not to introduce you in the opening, so let me say a few words quickly now. Serpa is the Director of the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership. She's an economist with quite extensive experience working in Southeast Asia since the 1990s, when she was supporting under UNDP the new economic management system in transitional countries. She's had 20 years or more of experience with the Asian Development Bank, focused on infrastructure and looking at that kind of improving the sustainability of infrastructure, which covers also, of course, on the governance side of things. So we were very pleased to have Ms. Serpa, our Director from ETP, joining us as well. And last but not least, we have Dr. Lloyd, who's joining us today. So Dr. Lloyd is a professor at the Atheneau School of Governance, and expertise is in governance, public policy, and applied statistics. In his early career, he's worked with multiple Philippine bureaucracies in various capacities. He was also a policy director of the Presidential Commission and a vice president for academics in 2 universities. He has extensive experience working with multilateral development partners and has been at the center of many things related to energy transition in the Philippines. So welcome to Dr. Lloyd as well. And last but not least, I introduce our moderator, who is our guide through all of these discussions today, which is Ibu Kuki. So Ibu Kuki is the founder and the director of the Indonesian Institute for Research on Decarbonization, sorry, I got that correct. She has extensive experience since the 1990s on energy and climate change issues in Indonesia. She's actively involved in supporting the Indonesian government on the COP process, and IRID, her organization, focuses on policy analysis and policy advocacy in climate-related issues, including energy. Welcome, Bu Kuki, and without further ado, I pass over to you to moderate our session today.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much, Pak Tarek, and good morning, everyone. So I know that we don't have much time, especially because it's also Friday and it's a short day for us, at least in Indonesia. So if you are all okay, then I will just start the session, the panel discussion for today. And since we have Pak Benny here, and thank you, Pak Benny. It was a very interesting presentation that you shared with us and all the information. And I think if we are talking about, looking at the presentation, Pak Benny, you show that in fact, the needs and the real investment is, the gap is very big. So, and you also mentioned earlier about a number of challenges, if I can say, and one of it is definitely at the end, you come up with resources, human resources, and other resources, as well as, human capital, right? And you also mentioned that the issue is one of the issue is basically because it was not included in a way in the investment or the calculation for investment. So, if we include all this human capital, as well as you mentioned about the structural change, then how do you see or how much that we're gonna need? And that would be one area of the overall discussion on renewable, right? But also if we are looking at the power sector, for example, in most of the country, or at least what we experience is here, there is always a big issue on how to have renewable energy enter the electricity market, if I can say. So how do you see it? Do you see that what would be the main, if I can say, main support, if I can say, for renewable energy to enter such a market? Do you think the governance or the regulation, or do you think that maybe incentive, disincentive would play a role better? And so from your experience, Pak Beni, that would be very much helpful for us as well. Thank you, Pak.
Thank you, Boogie. I think Sabi, we have wonderful people from the ministry who really dealing with that. I mean, it's going to be of course the needs. I mean, in the presentation I mentioned that is not including yet. There is no we are not able to identify how much the number to build the human resource here it's going to be. But of course, each ministry have its different needs, and as we have expert from Vietnam, maybe you can also share that what is the kind of the process that they have, and how much the budgets that could be also become a reference for the other countries in this region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pak Beni. And I think I'll just now move to the three panelists that we have from Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. One of the question already mentioned by Pak Beni, and I think this is something that we can learn also from each other. But before coming to that question, I think one issue that I understand is that all these three countries are currently working toward transitioning in their energy or power sector, specifically from fossil-based to renewable-based one. So for each, Pak Haris, Mr. Lloyd, as well as Mr. Hung, how do you see the role of governance in such transition, at least based on your experience? So if I can, I would like to invite first Pak Haris to, or maybe since I heard that Mr. Hung will be leaving, need to leave soon. So maybe Mr. Hung, if you can, share with us how the role of governance in Vietnam for this transition process. And if you can also add a bit on what Pak Beni mentioned earlier, the experience by Vietnam in building the human capital for renewable energy, basically. Thank you. So please, Mr. Hung, you have the floor.
So thank you very much, Cookie. Thank you for facilitating, and thank you all for having me in this useful and important roundtable discussion. Yes, Vietnam is a member of ASEAN, and we have rich potential of renewable energy. And yes, in Vietnam, since 2018 until now, we have which means 4 years. Also, we have a facilitating condition, and thankfully we have 10,000 megawatt of renewable energy, either solar or wind. So if we count only solar and wind, is already about 21,000 megawatt, or 27% of the total installed capacity, and making Vietnam having the highest installed capacity of renewable energy. So altogether, it's about 81,000. And our experience shows that in most of the case, it is about the feed-in tariff incentive. And so far, we have a specific incentive scheme for, let's say, a solar. It will end for the solar incentive already end in 2020, and for wind already end in 2021. And to do so, we have the very consistent policy from the highest level. For example, Vietnam run by the Communist Party, and we have a resolution by the party on facilitating or on a strategy on renewable energy development. And then following such a resolution by the Communist Party, we have different government level policy. For example, the feed-in tariff incentive, and also other incentive for operating the renewable energy project. And our experience shows that such an incentive only should be applied in a certain period of time. And then to develop the renewable energy resources, put it in the context of the electricity and power in ASEAN or in the world, for which Vietnam always a responsible member, for which we have committed for the neutrality of emission, for which our Prime Minister has announced in COP26. So for your information, we have a Power Development Plan 8, for which we have included many changes in this PDP 8, and for which Vietnam will no longer develop any new coal thermal power plant since 2030. And between now until then, we will phase out the existing coal thermal plant. And then for gas and liquid gas, we will develop only until 2030, and the existing coal thermal, there must be coal firing together between coal and other biomass and other materials. For example, coal and hydrogen and other source of biomass. I'm sorry, the connection is bad. I cannot hear from Mr. Hong. It seems that
yeah, it seems that
okay.
It's freezing, right? I mean, like at least.
Okay, so he's back. Okay, so no, I lose him again. I lose his voice again.
So it seems the connection is unstable.
Sorry, the connection is not stable. So he's talking about the role of the ERA, Electricity and Renewable Energy Agency under the MOEG. So my department play a significant role in facilitating the development of the renewable energy of the country. And underneath my department, there is a center, like an information center for renewable energy. And the member of that center includes all central ministry related to energy, related to the climate change. For example, Ministry of Construction, Ministry of Natural Resources and Environment. So and now about the human resources development. So we have EVN, Electricity of Vietnam, It is a state-owned corporation. So EVN and also either MOIT or either the DOIT, Department of Industry and Trade. So they all involved in the capacity development by training the people, by organizing different capacity workshop. And and I think those are altogether the measure for which it has Vietnam has increased rapidly of the share of renewable energy, reaching 27% of renewable energy over the total power installed capacity. So it only happened thanks to not only the investment policy, the incentive, but also the preparing of the necessary resources, and also the efficiency in implementing the government, the party's resolution and the government policies and laws. And as I mentioned, the incentive schemes should be applied only in a short period of time, because the renewable energy price will change rapidly. And instead of feed-in tariff-based incentive, it should be more on the market-based incentive. And at the same time, the technology of the renewable energy almost the same as the other source of energy, like either coal or gas and so on. So it means that for renewable energy, after some time of development, we see that we need to move from the feed-in tariff-based incentive to more like a competition-based or the market-based incentive. Of course, we still have some existing incentive, like reducing the custom duty for importing the renewable energy or the land price and so on, are still applied for the renewable energy. But we no longer apply the feed-in tariff-based incentive scheme. And in the future, we will, of course, continue to improve our legal framework to promote the offshore wind, because obviously Vietnam, based on the existing data, can have a huge potential of the offshore. And roughly, we have a 3,200 nautical kilometer of coastal line, and it is roughly estimate we have about 600 gigawatt potential of offshore wind. And we are working on an ocean spatial planning, for which offshore wind plan is a part of such ocean spatial planning. So once this two important plan will be approved by the government, and then it will be very strong legal basis to further develop the renewable energy, including the offshore wind. So that's all I would like to share with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Hung, and thank you for the very thorough explanation. Now I would like to come to Mr. Lloyd. Can you just share with us the role of the governance in your current transition? But due to the time limitation, maybe if you can do that in a minute or so. Thank you so much. Sorry for that.
Okay, no problem. The role of government in the Philippines is very crucial, because one of the things that we want to achieve is by 2030, we want to have the share of 35% of our renewable energy in the entire power mix, and then 50% by 2040. So these are the basic targets that we have right now. Since the enactment of our renewable energy law in 2008, our renewable energy declined from 34%. Now it's just 21%. So there's so much work that needs to be done. And just to express to you the urgency of really moving towards low carbon transition. Just recently, I just don't know if people here heard about the news, about 800,000 liters of oil in a cargo ship sank in the island of Mindoro, which is in the southern part of the Philippines. And now it's actually creating an environmental catastrophe in that area. So the shift towards low carbon and low carbon energy is an urgency, and it's crucial to the country's development. So one of the things that the government is doing right now is addressing the problem, the grid. It's a very technical problem because right now our grid cannot accommodate variable renewable energies such as solar and wind. Our baseload capacity is derived on coal, and we have been accommodating the stranded assets for quite some time. But fortunately, the government issued a moratorium on coal power plants since October of 2021. And we are now dramatically shifting towards renewable energy, particularly wind and solar. Like our friend from Vietnam, we have an insurmountable amount of solar energy, 160 gigawatts of available solar energy. Now, just to summarize everything, I think one of the things that government is doing right now is renewable energy financing. So there would be lots of policy on de-risking, tax holidays, and also subsidies. Second, we have to address the network externalities of our grid. The third is there is a need for coordination among different government agencies. And I think the best example here is in Germany. They're able to come up with an economic affairs ministry and they merge it with the climate action. So, you know, these things intersect. You cannot isolate economic development with energy transition. And this is the point that I want to highlight to this conference. You can never look at ASEAN in its transition towards low carbon energy without looking at just transition, because there is still a number of people from ASEAN that falls below the poverty line. And we need to navigate this transition, not in a sense that we would marginalize more people, but using the energy transitions to create more economic opportunities, more jobs for these people, and to help them transition towards a better quality of life. And I think this is the trade-off. We need to accelerate this energy transition. The Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change and extreme weather patterns. But at the same time, we have to understand that this transition has to be just. It has to look at the interests of the poorest of the poor, the marginalized and vulnerable sectors of society. And this is why the role of governance is important, because if we leave this energy transition as a private sector driven effort, most of these marginalized people will be affected in this transition. And that's it, Cookie.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd. And last but not least, I would like now to get the, from Pak Haris as well. So Pak, how do you see the role of governance in our energy transition, especially in the power sector in Indonesia? So please, Bapak, in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, but thank you.
All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me, right? Yeah, okay, good. Thank you. First of all, of course, I want to thank the committee for inviting me to this discussion and offer my perspectives in our forum this morning. First of all, I also want to thank Pak Benny, who has shared his a pretty comprehensive presentation and offered his opinions. And I see that in the current context,
within the current context, we have two big things that we implement simultaneously on how we could bring or provide the energy services in our respective countries and in the Asian regional level, and how to improve our energy security. That's the one thing. And secondly, we also had realized that greenhouse gases emission reduction had become a major priority that we need to do, both in our country, in regional level, and in the global level. And in Asian, we had also had the targets for both of those two agenda, and the implementation needs to be done according to our situation and condition in the respective country. Well, there are best practices from developed countries, but we need to look at our conditions as well. As the Dr. Lloyd mentioned before, there are still many community groups that we need to consider. For example, in Indonesia, we had more than 10,000 islands, so it's impossible to build a single grid that could connect them all. So this needs to be considered as well. So not all the best practice of all this grid system could be implemented in our situation, like in Indonesia. What we had implemented in Indonesia, especially for the renewable energy development, in order to achieve the short-term target in 2025, that is to achieve 23% of energy mix. At the current moment, the progress had not achieved the expected target. We only had 12% achievement for the energy mix from renewable energy, and it's about 12,000 megawatt of capacity all over Indonesia, in which we had hydropower about 6.7 gigawatt, biomass about 3 gigawatts, geothermal 2.3 gigawatts, wind 154 megawatts, and solar power 172 megawatt. Despite the potentials for the renewable energies could reach more than 3,000 gigawatts. So we are still utilizing a very small percentage of it. So how is the role of the government to accelerate the renewable energy or our energy transition towards the net zero emission? Right now in Indonesia, we had the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, and there are components within the ministry which regulates about oil and gas, coal and renewable energy, and about the electricity and power, and also National Energy Council, which are dedicated to conduct coordination between the sectors. We realize that one ministry cannot bring or realize this transition energy, because in the implementation, there are some linkages with the other ministries as well. For example, in Indonesia, if we are talking about renewable energy, new and renewable energy, it is not enough with the regulations from our ministry. Even the incentive we provide had to be provided by the other ministry as well. For example, if you are talking about fiscal ministry incentive, that has to involve Ministry of Finance. And this is, for example, also it is related with the Ministry of Environmental and Forestry, Ministry of Public Works, Ministry of Industry. Everything has to be integrated with one package, in one package. So we cannot do it in silo. And about the Indonesian case, the synchronicity of this policy in implementing the renewable energy must be built strongly. And therefore, we need to make a law that could implement those synchronizing activity. Right now, in terms of laws, it's still separated and scattered. So right now, we are trying to finish the draft for the law for new and renewable energy, which will synchronize the policies in the other ministries so that it could be aligned into one direction to bolster the acceleration to the transition energy which we need. And secondly, when we are talking about transition energy transition, let's not just talk about power, but non-electrical is also important, because from the 23% renewable energy mix from renewable also included a portion of non-power. For example, we have implemented B30 or B35. If 35% biodiesel from the renewable energy for vehicle fuel, and there is also a possibility of adding the portion of renewable fuel into for vehicle fuel. And in the domestic, it should become a major priority. And also from the institutional aspect, I think it's already sufficient and enough. And there will be some institutions and specific institutions dedicated to bolster, for example, nuclear energy, because in Indonesia, we expect that in order to meet with the rising demand for energy, it is most probable that nuclear energy would become one of the options to be selected or chosen, but it would be on the longer term, not in the short term. And for the budgeting and financing, we cannot do much when the renewable energy financing is a bit have a bottleneck. But Indonesia had been able to attract investment in the renewable energy, especially and if you saw the last moment, we have been able to utilize our momentum when we become chair of G20. And one of the theme of the G20 would be the energy transition. And as the result of the G20, there had been a financing commitment that Indonesia achieved, despite that we are now on the process to refine it. That is the CETI, or Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP, where there are some commitment of $20 billion financing, which are going to be used to implement fossil fuel transition towards new renewable energy. And we need to note that this energy transition cannot just be focused on one aspect. For example, in how to improve the renewable energy, but we need to think about and consider about the linkage to the fossil energy, because if we are talking about the renewable energy capacity, we are facing oversupply issues in infrastructure in Java Island, because because most of the demand for electricity are in Java, but right now we have oversupply situation in Java, but in the other islands they have deficit of energy or power, and they had, and Dr. Lloyd also mentioned also in the outer islands, as we also had the same, that the quality of the power also a bit lower. For example, about the coal situation as well, whether the ASEAN had also think about the financing of the decommissioning of the coal power plant, for example. This is what we are going to implement right now in Indonesia. And for GETP, the secretariat had been established under the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources to conduct the coordination and to share the information, provide information, and to receive project proposals which would be implemented via JETP programs. And we have to do a lot of other works in terms of ASEAN level. We understand that we had a lot of potentials for renewable energy and scattered in many Asian countries. And I believe this is something that we had in terms of our spirit and the target, but and also to synchronize the regional target in order to achieve the welfare for in terms of energy security and the greenhouse gas emission reduction. Of course, the interconnectivity of the regional physical grid must become priority. How to strengthen our energy security by conducting cross-border supply demand power grid, including for other from fossil fuel and also renewable energy. I think it's also become a part of the policy that must be endorsed and promoted in the secretariat, ASEAN secretariat, in order to achieve our common welfare, energy security, greenhouse gas emission reduction. I believe those are our main concern, and the rest would be the supporting how to improve our human resources capacity, human capital, and also to bring the technical assistance this should be an ongoing process, and all the incentives in each countries needs to be improved and strengthened, not only limited on the fiscal and non-fiscal incentive, but also other supports that could be more massive compared with the other ministries. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
Quite pressing, but I have a question to Ms. Sirpa Jarvenpa, because Ms. Sirpa, we learned that governance is basically one of the key issue, and as the Southeast Asia ETP, will Southeast Asia ETP also support in such a governance reform or restructuring, or and if it is so, then what and how, and also if there is already any support being given so far, Mr. Pa. So the floor is.
Thank you, Ibu Kuki, very much for that very good question. So just in few words, ETP was established to accelerate energy transition, and we fully believe that governance is the first stop in that process. So indeed, the strategic objectives of ETP relate to policy alignment with climate commitments. This is an objective that directly responds to your question. So most of our programs actually relate to improvement in governance and creating coherence in governance. We are also working toward de-risking finance for energy efficiency and renewable energy investments. And here again, the creating of a level playing field, and I really can appreciate the Deputy Director General Han's points that we need to create a level playing field where the various technologies and financing schemes can compete, and that can then foster lowering of costs and risks for investments. We're also working towards extending the smart grids, which creates the framework for being able to integrate renewable energy and that way remove physical, very tangible impediments to the energy transition. And here, the governance program really translates to ownership of these assets and how the private sector can be integrated in funding this daunting need for upgrading investments. And finally, we do work on the underpinnings of building knowledge and awareness. So that's obviously required so that the stakeholders and the country authorities can drive and champion energy transition for us in these countries. I mean, just for examples, in the Philippines, we work with the Energy Regulatory Commission on overhauling the regulation, the framework for regulations to ensure that there aren't any contradictions to energy transition within the ambit of the regulatory framework. In Indonesia, we are supporting what Pak Haris just mentioned, the coherency among the energy policies. So we need to make sure that they are synchronized and that they absorb now the newly declared targets for peaking of carbon dioxide emissions. In Vietnam, we are working on many fronts actually regarding governance. One example is we are supporting the government in assessing the impacts of the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that brings along the issues and design of a carbon tax policy, which will help, of course, drive energy transition throughout the country. Here in Hanoi, where I'm located right now. So thank you, Ibu Kuki, for that very good question.
Thank you so much, Mr. Pa. And I think Pak Benny earlier mentioned about the potential or the needs of having, like bringing up this renewable energy to the ministerial level. So just a short answer from each of the representative from each country. So Pak Haris, Dr. Lloyd, and also Mr. Hong, do you agree or do you think it is possible to bring up, and is it needed to bring up the renewable energy into that level, to that ministerial level, rather than now maybe at DG level? So just yes or no. So please, Dr. Lloyd first, and then Pak Yahya and Mr. Hong.
Well, I surmise the level would be a policy making level where you have a climate change agency that basically handles the coordination among different agencies. We cannot isolate energy, renewable energy, economics altogether, but you need a high level policy coordinating body that will make different agencies work with one another.
Yep, I think that's a good suggestion to leverage, to elevate this discussion through the ministry level. But I think we need to address the issues at the implementation level. How the electricity industries in each of our countries, they play a very important role when we talk about how these policies are implemented, particularly maybe in the case of Indonesia. Indonesia is still holding close to the principle of single buyer. At least in the case of Indonesia, it doesn't have to be managed by just one ministry just to take care of the issues of electricity or power. That's single, unless if one day it's made possible to have other mechanisms. Right now, probably we'll just have to deal with it with the existing new and renewable energy director general and consolidate with the national energy committee that coordinates between agencies and ministries, and to strengthen the existing regulations. So these sort of agencies, which I think we need to enhance their capacities. I don't think we need to create like a new separate ministry, because we already have, we also have to take into account that efficiency factor. Thank you.
Mr. Hong, how do you see the proposal or the suggestion of having a renewable energy ministry? I hope Mr. Hong is still around. Yes.
Đề xuất thì so thank you again for your question. So as I have presented earlier, so because we are different country, we are at a different size, a different development level, and however, I consider that as a first stage of renewable energy development, there should be some incentive schemes so that we can facilitate the development and we can accumulate the experience. For example, however, when the renewable energy reach a certain level, for example, 10 megawatt for solar or wind, and then we should move from the tariff-based incentive to the competition or the market-based incentive, so that we can select the best player. And I think it is a journey, it is a roadmap, but depending on each country, that either we may have a separate law on renewable energy, or or it can be a part of the law on power or the law on energy or electricity whatsoever. And then we should have a clear competition policy or regulation so that we can select the best player. So at first, in the first years, we may consider the feed-in tariff incentive schemes.
Yeah. Thank you.
And because the technology in the renewable energy will change very fast, so I think that we should move from the tariff-based to the other form of incentive.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Hong. And I apologize to the participants that we cannot have like a direct conversation, but I saw that there are already a lot of questions in the Q&A box. So I would like to invite all the panelists also to respond directly in written in the Q&A box. And Pak Tarek, I'll just hand it over to you back. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Bukuki, and to the panelists and of course to Pak Benny, the presenter. That was a really interesting session on governance there. We are a little bit behind time, so I'm going to move a little bit quickly here. Session 2, we're talking about markets, and that's the status of markets and the changes we need in market reform to attract renewable energy. So without slowing too much, I'm going to introduce our 2 keynote speakers, and we're lucky to have 2 in this session. Our first keynote speaker is Mr. Dmitry Peshia. He's from the Agora Energy Vendor, and he's been working extensively on energy transition on the policy side for Southeast Asia, Europe, and many other places. So we will pass now directly to you, Dmitry, for your keynote presentation.
Thanks a lot, Tarek, and good morning to everyone. I'm very glad to be here with you today. Agora Energiewende is a think tank based in Berlin, but we also have offices in Bangkok, and we implement a project financed by the Ministry of Economics and Climate from Germany, which is implemented together with GIZ, the German International Corporation, and also local partners in the region. And I will speak about, indeed, the role of markets for the power sector transition in Southeast Asia. Next slide, please. I think the momentum around energy transition is really accelerating in Southeast Asia. We have had several net zero commitments in the region, and we have this whole discussion ongoing in Vietnam, Indonesia with the JETP agreements. The question is not anymore, I think, why we need a transition, but how to make it happen. And on this graph, you see the share of variable renewables in the different countries in ASEAN. And what is striking is that, except for Vietnam, all the countries have a share lower than 5%. And why I say it's striking is because if you want to align the net zero commitment of all these countries, you probably need a share of at least 25% of wind and solar power in 2030, so in the next 7 years. Why wind and solar? It's because they are the most cost-effective renewable technologies, and they have the highest resource available. So Pak Benny mentioned this 23% renewable energy target for ASEAN, but here we speak about a 25% target only for wind and solar power. So how market can help this transformation? Next slide, please. This is a bit of a vision of how to integrate variable renewables in system based on international experiences. You have different phases, and I think what is important for this discussion is that these countries in Southeast Asia, they are really in the first phases of the transformation. And in terms of political instruments and regulation, we really need to focus on these priorities, which is indeed incentivize investment in zero emission technologies. It's to abate inflexibility in the arrangement of the power system, and it's to move the operation of this system closer to real time. There is a lot of other issues in terms of planning, which are actually relevant, but which are not the priority for really scaling up renewables now. Next slide, please. So where do we stand with the market model in Southeast Asia? This map shows the diversity of models that we have in the region. The single buyer model prevails actually in hybrid forms, which are positioned between the monopoly we find in Brunei and competitive markets that we find in Singapore or the Philippines. So, for example, Pak Haris just mentioned this. We have a vertically integrated utility in Indonesia, with also access given to power independent power producers, IPPs. Similar model, but at the regional level in Malaysia. In Thailand, we have partially integrated utilities plus IPPs. And in Vietnam, we have a kind of a regulated wholesale market. What is important is that the ambition for further reform have always been dashed by political constraints. And these hybrid models, that is now the norm in the region, is working well in some cases and is working less in others. So importantly also is that none of this model is fit now for the scale and pace of change which is required for renewable-based transition. So market design must adapt quickly. Next slide. There are actually various examples in Southeast Asia where the current market design hampers renewable investment and renewable integration. On the investment side, there have been often a lack of planning and political commitments. And because of subsidies and absence of carbon pricing, the true generation costs are not exposed. So no price signals exist to counter the reliance on fossil-based assets. On the other side, there is also the cost of capital is often very high due to financial structure and investment risks. And we see also regulatory discontinuity, for example, in Vietnam, where the feed-in tariff has driven the rapid market uptake but is currently reassessed. Or other countries where feed-in tariffs are actually not competitive, like in Indonesia. So this is for the investment side barriers, but also from the perspective of system integration, there are several examples where the design is not supportive. For example, I think the most prevailing one is the contractual inflexibility, which favor large block of mass run capacity of coal and gas in Thailand or Indonesia. And also the lack of short-run price signals or market arrangement that encourage flexibility. So next slide. What should be the role of markets to accelerate the transition? Well, markets organize simply the sale and purchases of goods and services, right? So in that sense, all countries in the region have some types of markets that are shown in this graph, but those markets differ along the several dimensions, like the level of regulation, the level of centralization, the time horizon. And the point is that those many forms are not limited to competitive markets, which are prescribed by textbook economics. They differ in scope, in operational mechanism, and also in their objectives. So they reflect actually political priorities and interests. And when policy priorities change, often the markets should also change. And this applies actually in all countries in Southeast Asia. So today, the policy ambition and implementation are not well aligned in nearly all the Southeast Asian countries. So market reforms or refinement should be embedded in this broader vision and strategies to deliver the energy transition targets. It involves actually a strong role of the states, being it in coordinating role or in a participatory role. Next slide. So what are the different market segments? Market can cover different aspects of the value chain of electricity, capacity on the left, which is actually investment markets, energy in the middle, basically wholesale electricity markets, and system services on the right. You can click one more time, and there is also the retail markets. So when discussing markets, it's important to keep in mind what challenges one seeks to address and which part of the value chain is concerned. Market mechanism for investment can be introduced in a regulated system without really fundamental reform. So this is actually a quick win. The introduction of wholesale and ancillary service markets are more complicated and require structural reform. This is actually the main reason why they are absent in many of the Southeast Asian countries. Another point is that markets across the value chain interact with each other. So if you reform the investment market, it will have an impact on the wholesale market and vice versa. So you need to ensure that the interaction must be taken into account in order to avoid negative spillover effects. Next slide. Oh, next one, actually. So quickly on the investment markets, renewable energy auctions, I think, and tenders are probably the most important tool. They help to find the lowest cost for capacity addition, especially because wind and solar are capital intensive. They require revenue certainties over a long time frame, and it also requires minimize the investment risk and lower the cost of the project. Renewable tenders and auctions have been hugely successful to develop renewable all around the globe, and they allow public authorities to set the requirements and parameters for new capacities like so localization, component, or even local content. And as such, they are well aligned with the central planning and regulated system. But there is also risks, and to overcome those, it's all about a clever design. For example, how to avoid the exclusion of small players, how to avoid underbidding or risk of collusions. So all of these questions need to be addressed by clever regulation. Next slide. Those investment markets can help to drive investment, but it is actually also depending on a lot of framework conditions. I will not go in details here, but it's all about proper access to finance. It's also about the effective governance framework that we just discussed. It's also predictable policy support. And also what Mr. Hung also mentioned, it's about finding a supply chain which include access to material, but also the trade arrangements with supplier countries. Next slide. Now, from the perspective of incentivizing integration in the energy market and how to incentivize flexibility. So with a lot of variable renewable in the system, we have a very fluctuating operation of the system. And we need to balance supply and demand at all times with more variability. There is a lot of flexibility options to compensate for this variation. We need to operate the power plants more flexibly. We need to use grids to balance export and imports. There is also demand-side response options, storage, and even in the long run, sector coupling to decarbonize also industry heat and mobility. And this paradigm of flexibility require a totally different market arrangement. And if you go in the next slide, I think the main message is that, next slide, please. Yeah. In order to fully tap this technical potential, it is crucial to adapt power market condition and regulation. So the short-term energy markets basically reveal the short-run value of electricity, and it becomes increasingly important to reveal this value for variable system. The price is having an impact on the short run, so to have a cost-efficient dispatch, but also in the long run to invest in flexibility options. So for Southeast Asia, I think the guiding principle for market refinement should really be dispatch, which is based on marginal costs, flexibility requirement in the power purchase agreement, and also shorter trading arrangements. And finally, an adjustment of the balancing practices. Now, short-term markets are key to cope with volatility, but they may not provide sufficient investment certainty. This is why the first component I discussed is also very important. And in Europe, typically in the context of the energy crisis, a lot of the liberalized markets actually went back to regulation, including price caps, in order to provide more long-term vision for investors. So I think it's really a balance between reform on the energy market to incentivize flexibility and having a support scheme for investment. And it will be my last slide, the next one. Next one, yeah. Just to conclude, oh, no, it was just the one before. Yes, thank you. I think in order to align with net zero commitment, ASEAN countries must scale up wind and solar very fast. And we need deciders to focus on most important priorities, which is to invest in zero emission technology, also to phase out coal, abate and flexibility, and move operation close to real time. Investment markets are required to develop renewables, and broader market reform will be time-consuming and probably too complicated because of political constraints. So we need to focus on the quick fix. And here, the single buyer model can actually be the basis for incremental improvement. We need to find a balance between state and markets to optimize the dispatch, mobilize investment, and ensure affordability. And this may require new market mechanism for short-term system operation, but still keeping a strong role for the state in planning and investment. Thank you very much for this attention.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. An excellent presentation there, and those conclusions at the end are especially useful, I think, for the discussion coming up. Okay, now we shall turn to our second keynote presenter, Professor Frank Yotso, who we've already introduced as the head of energy at the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at ANU. Frank, if you're there, floor is yours for your keynote.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you very much. And it's great to hear from Dimitri and Agora. Of course, there's really monumental things going on in terms of energy transition in Europe, Germany, elsewhere, and there's important lessons to be learned from that. And so what I would like to do in this brief presentation is share some insights from Australia, where likewise very big shifts are underway. In summary, really, we have a shift underway from a heavily coal and fossil fuel dominated energy and electricity system to one that will certainly be dominated almost to exclusion of most other things by wind and solar power. And that places enormous challenges actually for market frameworks and policy frameworks, but it does actually look like there is a viable way through this for managing this transition. And the key is, of course, as always, to mobilize the investment that's needed to make all of this happen and do so predictably and do so fast. Okay, so the fundamental point here is really the renewable energy transition, a clean energy transition requires very large upfront investments, right? We're looking at a transition to a system that will run at very low costs, but in turn requires very high upfront financing costs. That's the fundamental difficulty here in terms of mobilization of upfront capital. How to mobilize the investments? Well, you know, in state-directed or state-owned systems, it's really a question of government decision-making. In energy market systems, it's more complicated because you need to create frameworks that will provide adequate and predictable returns to private investors. Yeah, and you need to create future expectations about those returns in order for investors, both commercial entities and financing institutions, to actually put up their money into these installations on what is currently, under most situations, uncertain future returns. The situation in market systems is complicated by the fact that renewable energy systems typically produce energy at zero marginal cost, right? So if you own a wind turbine, it doesn't cost you any more to run that wind turbine than it does to have that wind turbine just sitting there. And in energy-only markets, that means that you will bid into the market at $0 per megawatt hour, right? Because you will take every cent that you can get, right? And that tends to push prices down in spot markets, and we're seeing that absolutely happen in Australia. And so for installations that rely on spot markets, that can create difficulty. Role of policy, of course, what instruments to incentivize clean energy is really a big question here. So state ownership, of course, right, is a relatively straightforward way of organizing this. Carbon pricing is very useful in terms of strengthening the hand of low and zero carbon emissions generation and other sources relative to fossil fuel installations, and to dampen any remaining tendency to keep investing in fossil fuels, right? So that's really a very, very important part of an efficient policy mix in that transition, where fossil fuels still play an important role. Subsidy mechanisms, of course, you know, the difficulty here is calibration, right? There's been very many instances of setting subsidy too high and thereby wasting taxpayers' money. Increasingly, we see mechanisms like contracts for power delivery, including in ways that harness the market to avoid overpaying for clean energy. Okay, then there's also the idea, of course, or the practice of capacity markets, where you create a market and a payment scheme that rewards the existence of generating capacity, not the delivery of any particular amount of energy into the market. Now, illustrating this point, just how rapid is this transition that we're dealing with here in Australia? This is Australia's power sector mix over the last 24 years. We went from solar and wind constituting less than 10% in the 2010s, right, to well over a third in the last 12 months, and a firm expectation that wind and solar will provide over 80% of Australia's electricity by 2030. This is an extremely rapid transition. And if you want a glimpse of the future, look at the far end of our grid here in South Australia. That's a sizable grid that at many times during the week regularly runs on 100% solar and wind energy. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the power mix of the last 7 days in South Australia, and you can see that really every day over the middle of the day when solar power produced most, solar and wind energy were sufficient to cover the entire electricity supply in that state, with a little bit of gas generation always chugging along, providing grid stabilization services. In future, we will expect that this role will not be played by gas, but by battery storage and potentially pumped hydro storage. And the reason why that is becoming more cost effective is that we see negative spot market prices for energy in the middle of the day. Okay, so that's that faint red line down the bottom. Every day when we have 100% renewables in South Australia, the spot market's price dip below zero. There's a large 100 megawatt hours battery, 100 megawatt battery there that charges up during the middle of the day and is actually paid to charge. Okay, so this is what you may expect really the world over in high renewable energy penetration grids at some point in the future. So past experience practice, of course, you know, heavy state-led investment in fossil fuels. Then we had a period where we made extra payments for renewables through a quota trading scheme. Currently, there's really no fossil fuel investment because it's not competitive. The future really is, current practice in renewable energy investment largely is to have these new wind and solar plants underwritten by contracts for difference, right? And so usually a subnational government opens up a tender and asks for bids for power prices for the supply of wind and solar power over 15 or 20 years. And it's that government that takes the upside risk and the downside risk of market prices. Okay, and what that means is that the financing costs for the private builder and operator of that plant are much cheaper, right? Because they haven't got a risk on their revenue, right? The financial risk regarding power prices, future power prices, is on the government's balance sheet, and that results in much lower power prices than you otherwise would. Typical feed-in prices under such negotiated agreements are in the order of Australian dollars 50 per megawatt hour lower. So that's in the order of $35 per megawatt hour or below for wind and solar. It's really extremely cheap, and it's getting cheaper. The future for fossil fuel plants, really gas declining, no more coal, and importantly, transition arrangements for the remaining coal-fired power stations. In Australia, these are done case by case by subnational governments. There's, of course, other arrangements that can be taken, and, you know, things like JETP and the ADB's initiative in Indonesia are really terribly important in that regard. We've got to make that work well. Okay, that's actually top priority in that transition away from old coal-fired power plants. Future for renewables investment, well, you expect contracts for different scheme to continue. We're seeing a shift to more state ownership, outright equity ownership in new generating facilities. It's really just a variation on the contracts for different scheme. We expect that there will be a fast rising role for just outright market-driven, privately owned and operated renewable energy plants. Energy storage is also important. I mentioned it already as a balancing act for wind and solar dominated systems. Pumped hydro or grid batteries. We're seeing grid batteries deployed on a commercial basis already in Australia. And we've got a very large government owned and built pumped hydro scheme under operation, which has run into enormous difficulties on the engineering and physical construction side of things. The future is probably a mix of state ownerships, subsidies, and potentially capacity markets for the private provision of energy storage. Electricity market reform is a big topic in Australia because it is not clear that the existing electricity market, which is the energy-only market, designed for the efficient operation of fossil fuel power plants is in fact the best and suitable framework for a future system that's dominated by renewables. I won't go into detail about that, but it is a live consideration as to what adjustments to make to provide greater predictability of future revenue to renewables. Transmission investment is also very important, of course, in terms of getting the infrastructure happening that will actually deliver the energy to consumers. Relevance for Southeast Asia, well, kind of obvious, I won't dwell on it. Where the power sector is fully or largely state-owned, we need to make sure that the investments made are the efficient investment and that they're made in a timely fashion, right? There's always a risk that perhaps some inefficiencies creep in terms of the decision-making around investment as well as operation. And there's a risk, of course, in terms of overinvestment in long-lived fossil fuel assets, in particular considering the very large influence, of course, of those industries, in particular in countries where there is a domestic fossil fuel producing industry, in particular coal mining. And so where markets are in operation, of course, all of the things I mentioned in terms of market reform and the clever choice of policy instruments to support markets deliver on the energy transition. Broader lessons, and I'm coming to the end here, really new energy systems may need new market frameworks and usually need dedicated policy frameworks. So it really requires a re-examination of how a power system works, right? How revenue is created, and what opportunities there are for reform, can often be incremental reform that provides that investment predictability and the positive investment signals for the energy assets of the future. I do argue that the key role for governments is to de-risk private investments. Any transition you look at like this in world history, any technology, at this stage, when things are really beginning to shift and to grow, you have an enormous amount of uncertainty about just how this pans out, right? Will future renewable energy plants perhaps be much cheaper still than present day ones, right? What will be the revenue models? What will be the market models? That results in a reluctance by the private sector to invest and or a requirement for really high rates of return, which push project costs up. There are very good experiences the world over of governments stepping in and providing that reassurance to private investors that things will work out well by either taking a lot of the upside and downside risk onto the government's balance sheet in some form, or even by just taking on some of the downside risk, right? And that can do wonders to make the investment flow at relatively low costs because the finance premiums will be low. So thank you very much. I greatly look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Professor Frank. Okay, now we will pass over to our moderator for the session, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Labondo. Michael is a visiting professor at Asano School of Governance, and he has a lot of experience in sustainable energy inside the Asia-Pacific region, especially on ocean energy, where he spent a lot of effort in kind of bringing this technology to the fore in planning. So Michael, we'll pass over to you for facilitation. Just to very quickly introduce our panelists as well. So we have three panelists joining us today. We have from Indonesia, Mr. Dion Arinaldo, who's joining. He's the program manager for the Institute for Program Manager of Energy Transformation at the Institute for Essential Services Reform. And Pak Dion is actually, his professional career has gone through an energy transition of its own. He started in coal and has moved now into this renewable energy space. So we welcome his perspective. We have Assistant Director, Ms. Luningning Baltazar. Apologies if I have pronounced the name wrong. She is Assistant Director of the Electricity Power Industry Management Bureau at the Department of Energy in the Philippines, and comes with extensive, more than 15 years of experience in government side of planning and policy formulation. She had a pretty significant role in the Electricity Power Industry Reform Act of 2001, and has been active ever since in Philippines. Last but not least, we have Miss Vuchi Mai, who's joining us from Vietnam, and she's part of the GIZ team there. She's the program manager for clean and affordable sustainable energy in Southeast Asia. So CASE, that's the partner project of our ETP. And Vuchi Mai has has been working with energy program of GIZ in Vietnam since 2009, and she has been the team leader for a number of the CASE components. Example, the 4E project, which is the clean, affordable, and sustainable energy for the 4E project. So I've shortened the introductions, and I'll let the speakers have more chance for talking themselves. So over to you, Mike.
Yes, thank you so much, Tarek. I'm just confirming that you can hear me okay. Yeah, I hope so. Okay, very good. So panelists, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence today. Dion, Ning Ning, and Miss Vu Chi Mai, is that right? Yeah, pronounce it correctly. All right, perfect. So I think let's just dive into, we've heard two excellent presentations on markets. I think insights into the Australian experience and the regional perspective as well. In order for us to do a bit of reflection, it might be good, and I'm combining a couple of points here. Could I just go around our panelists and just ask what was the most striking message that you got from our keynotes, and how relevant are these findings to the national context, for your national context of the country that you're from? So since there are two ladies and one gentleman, I'll start with the gentleman first, if that's okay. Dion.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. So I'll start with the what's most striking. Okay, I think both presentation is great. Dimitri has given us kind of like a framework of market itself, how does market could operate, and give us a perspective on an option for each of our own country, probably to look into how do we want to transform our market towards which pathway. And I like that he mentioned on the conclusion that it's a hybrid market probably for Southeast Asia. And also, I think it's a great also addition from Frank, giving us a sort of Australian experience and what to expect and what are they struggling with. And this is probably gives us a more medium-term perspective on considering this market reform options. And probably for Indonesia context, I'll start with the Indonesia's renewable energy development. So I think it's clear now that in the long term for our energy transformation, Indonesia will rely on variable renewables mostly. So it can be seen from the Ministry of Energy Net Zero Energy Roadmap. There is actually 33% of electricity is coming from solar itself, or renewable energy, PRE. And we need about 400 gigawatt for that in 2060, if I'm not mistaken. And this is a huge number from currently installed capacity around 200 megawatt, something like that. So the gap is 400 gigawatt. It's a huge market in Indonesia. And if you look into other studies, similar study from IEA, ARENA, and we also have conducted our own studies, we see that the role of VR is actually higher in that studies consideration. In IEA, we see 50% of VRE, ARENA projects 67%, and ISR we consider 80%. So we are the most ambitious one in terms of VRE actually. Yeah, and that's my first point. Indonesia itself is a huge market for renewable energy development, but for the market itself, it's a single buyer market. It's being the single buyer is our state-owned enterprise, PLN, and there is a reason for that. Of course, actually in the past, Indonesia has attempted to kind of like unbundle their market. It's actually being made into law actually in 2002, but it was deemed unconstitutional at the time, and then we have returned to this format right now, in which the prevailing law is the law number 30, 2009. So in this law, the government has the right to manage the essential resources, and electricity is considered one of them. And in turn, the government has given PLN, the state-owned enterprise, to sole the first right to manage and sell electricity in Indonesia. And that's why we have now comes into this single buyer model in Indonesia. And the other part that is important from Indonesia context is that our electricity price is heavily regulated. The price is set by the government with the approval of the parliament. So you see that there is a lot of political interest in just setting the price. And in fact, we haven't really updated our electricity sale price for the consumer in the past few years, although just recently for just a specific customer, high-level residential household. So those two are I think, what shapes Indonesia market as it is currently. And for the transformation to happen, I think those still need to be considered in Indonesia. And I think that's for now. And I'll give it back to you, Michael.
And move on to Ms. Wu. If you could also grace us with which points you think are most striking from our keynotes and how they apply in the context of Vietnam.
Yes, thank you, Michael. And also thank you, Dimitri and Professor Giotto, for your excellent and very, meaningful content for further discussion from the two presentations from me from Vietnam. The most striking about the keynote is the first one from Professor Giotto is we need to make sure that investment in renewable energy, including energy storage and transmission, is made timely, efficiently. And also the risk of over-investment in long-life fossil fuel assets. And also we come together with, keynotes or further thought from Dimitri that the deciders must focus on short-term priorities here. Incentive mechanism investments into in zero emission to technologies and phase out of coal is very relevant for us because also we see in the last 3 years Vietnam enjoying or acknowledge also the very dynamic development of renewable energy, but due to technical barriers, the system could not absorb more and a very short time variable renewable energy. There is a gap of policy, and it's time now to to reboost the renewable energy with as Dimitri said, we should now focus on short-term priorities. We should, or the Vietnamese government should focus and keep the momentum of investment into renewable energy. And that means we need now a new mechanism more suitable for Vietnam, a clear and transparent policy vision for investors. Last but not least, also energy transition, meanings also the coal phasing out. And Vietnam still rely quite heavily on coal because it's a cheap source for Vietnam. And actually it contributed also to the low level of electricity price for Vietnam. And also heavily depends on tax, on income, and so on. The transition of the phase out of coal need to be carefully assessed and also with thoughtful decision. The just part in the energy transition must then also be carefully assessed and considered. Additionally, I also would like to add that energy transition is the way that we have to continue, because it's very complex it deals with power, it deals with transportation, with industry. So various ministries of Vietnam must join hand, and also it deals with different social class, and always the just factor must be well considered. That means also all the how to say stakeholders from the policymaker to the community level, they must well aware and accept the energy transition. Last but not least, also the coordination among the ministries, because it deals with different responsibility, if different how to say strategy of sectoral strategies. So coordination among ministries is a must. Last but not least, also the oversight activity of the National Assembly to monitor and also to have reflection of the implementation on site. What needs to be done, what needs to be reconsidered, and so on. So it's a very holistic and integrated approach that we have to follow. Yes.
Thank you, Leslie. Those insights are very, very useful. Thank you so much for sharing them. Now, may I solicit Mam Lu Ning Ning, Mam Lu, I don't know if that's your nickname, but I will call you Mam Lu, if that's okay. Could we solicit your thoughts as well? Which of the messages from the keynotes are most striking for you and for the Philippines? And given the sort of national situation or context of the Philippines, how do you think are these findings relevant, and which points do you think you might want to add, similar to our previous two panelists, in the context of what was just said? Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. So you may call me Ning, that's my nickname. And good morning, everyone. And I'm happy to share our experience through this panel discussion. And what struck me most is that on the presentation, they underscored the need to find a new balance between state and markets, optimizing dispatch, mobilizing investment, and ensuring affordability. And of course, the government assuming the risk, some of the risks in ensuring that the transition to clean energy will be achieved. I'm glad that the Philippines is actually, and I'm proud to say that we are ahead in terms of the reforms in the electricity market. And our market is 17 years. And after the liberalization of the electric power in the industry in the Philippines, our main goal remains to ensure that there is affordable power for everyone. But that remains a crucial challenge for the Philippines, for the Department of Energy at that, because we remove all subsidies. We strive as much as possible to ensure that the costs are competitive, and when we start to draw or to invite RE in our system, that was a challenge in that it requires us to allow some form of cross-subsidization from the consumers themselves, so that we can be able to achieve certain level of clean energy. Although in terms of the total context of the renewable energy, we are somehow comfortable at 22%, but we're looking at new variable renewable energy, and that's right, we are still below 5%, but still we have so much in the pipeline. And I think what the markets can do in this context is that in the current mechanism that we have employed in the Philippines, we have allowed the preferential dispatch of this renewable energy, particularly those who we were able to secure through the feed-in tariff. And later on, we conducted the green energy auction program for the first last year, and then this year we're planning to do another round also, but we're still looking at the targets, and we're looking at more aggressive targets given by the the new political direction, the leadership that we need to embark more on renewable energy, and we're considering also the extent how batteries can support these new developments, this capacity addition, and in terms of also, I would like to share to the other ASEAN neighbors that it's really true that transmission plays a key role, because we have experienced that some of our renewable energy may not be strategically located, or in terms of having that access to transmission, such that there are times that they were not dispatched, and that's something that we need to look at as both on the policy side and of course for the regulator, because the transmission side of our industry is highly regulated. So in that manner, it's a must that in our policy and planning and power systems planning, we need to ensure that there is a harmonious timing between the projects and the transmission component, or there are other mechanisms that allow the proponent to invest in the transmission and then recover it later. So that is very crucial for the system, because without the transmission, even if there's the generation component, we cannot make use of that. So currently our market allows for preferential dispatch for those under for all RE. But the challenge is those BREs that are not covered by the feed-in tariff and the energy auction, specifically when the market prices are very low. And in other markets, we note that there are already negative prices for those markets that have an abundance of BREs, specifically solar and wind. And as such, we allow them a preferential dispatch. There's another option also for them to nominate themselves to offer or to sell at their marginal cost. So that's one way for them to recover, other than entering into a bilateral contract. So I think in that this I have so much to say, but very limited time. And on taking the government taking the risk, I'm not sure if at this point, because the very reason that we liberalize the power sector is that the government cannot anymore take the risk to support the requirement of the power of the entire country in terms of power support, and as such, the current strategy is to leverage on the capacity of the consumer, such that we allow them to choose RE through the green energy option. And we started with the 100 kilowatt, and now we're contemplating on moving, relaxing further the threshold below that 100 kilowatt. And also, of course, there's net metering. But I think the challenge is removing the barriers for the access to the distribution system, the processing, the permitting, because currently there are certain factors that affects that, and we're closely looking at that. So I think with the stage that we are currently at the current level of the VREs in our country, we're looking at an additional of 3,500 in the coming 3 to 5 years, and that's only for the component of the green energy auction and renewable, the feed-in tariff. And then we're looking forward, of course, with the renewable energy market is already in place, and we're hoping that with the mandatory compliance of the participants, more investments can be attracted in the next 2 to 3 years, because the renewable energy market may kick off commercially within the next 2 to 3 years, considering that there will be requirement for the mandated participants to ensure their compliance. Thank you.
Lot of content there to digest. There's orchestration and stitching requirements for various stakeholders. That's awesome. I'm going to pass the ball a little bit, but we need to manage time. Professor Frank, a couple of questions from the floor. Frank, how does electricity markets in Australia push for more variable energy sources and deal with ancillary service markets, if any? How do those correlate? That's one question, and I think you can bundle it with another question here. Could you further elaborate on the Australian government experiences in de-risking private investment in RE? Could I give you a minute and a half to sort of answer those two questions together?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'll start with the small question here, ancillary services. And so increasingly we see grid scale batteries dominating the market for ancillary services. So frequency control as well as voltage control is now done quicker and more reliably by grid scale batteries than by fossil fuel assets. And so you know, the world's biggest battery in South Australia, Tesla material, makes the majority of its money in the ancillary services market, right? And so it's of course great base for private investment in batteries, but you know, all those new batteries will eat each other's lunch. There's an auxiliary services market that's only that large, and it will need to be distributed between the different storage assets, right? That's taken care of as an important element, actually, in making these storage assets, especially batteries, happen and operating them efficiently, because the operators, of course, make sure that there's battery capacity available at all times to provide ancillary services, not just energy services. In terms of investment in renewables, so what's happening in energy-only market, right? As soon as you have a supply constraint of energy capacity, right? In particular, as soon as a coal-fired power station exits the market, average prices will increase because the remaining power plants have greater market power. Okay. This also happens when some of the existing coal-fired power stations go off-grid because they're down for maintenance and they break or whatever, which increasingly happens because these things are old and a little decrepit, actually, in some cases. That pushes market prices up and thereby draws wind and solar in because they can profit massively from these elevated power prices. And so the energy-only market is working in this way, in that it brings additional renewable energy into the mix when fossil fuel power is unreliable or goes off the grid. But it's a sawtooth pattern, right? Power plant out of the grid, right? Prices jump up, you get new capacity in, wind and solar, and gradually your price comes down again. Very briefly on that market suspension last year. So what happened was actually nothing to do with renewables. It had everything to do with coal-fired power plants and the very high price of gas. So and abnormally large amounts of coal-fired power stations were out because of repairs, unanticipated repairs. And the gas price was so extremely high that the gas generators put in crazily high bids into the market and wholesale prices just exploded. And the energy market operator used emergency powers to just suspend the market and direct generators to provide electricity at a predetermined flat rate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Frank. On that note, I transfer to Ms. Wu. There's a question from an attendee about Vietnam having cheap power from coal, and you know there were losses in 2022 for EVN. Was this due to certain reasons, or like was it because of high global coal price or gas price? Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, actually, due to the fact that Vietnam have been the net importer of coal since 2015, and the energy sector rely quite heavily on the import. And you see also the fluctuation of coal recently, and also oil the same. And that's why, and next to that also to the energy demand of Vietnam after COVID comes back, and the demand reached for 8% growth. Yeah, leading to the loss of EVN in that case. Yeah.
Okay, Thank you, Ms. Wu. Dimitri, I'm going to ask you to respond a little bit to Mam Ning's comment. She mentioned that governments try to liberalize power markets because they can't afford to risk investment anymore and need the private sector to step in. How should ASEAN countries de-risk investment in the electricity sector? Any thoughts?
I'm not sure I understood your question correctly because the sound was not very good, but I think you asked how to ensure that we can attract investment, basically. So
de-risking the investment. The Philippines tried to liberalize power markets, right? To maybe attract private sectors to step in. So do you think that plus more would be needed for ASEAN countries to de-risk investment?
So there is a lot of different dimensions to consider, but as an investor, you want to be sure.
You to 1 minute and 30 seconds. So
yeah. Just give me 1 minute. As an investor, why would you invest in renewables to start with, right? So you need to have actually a regulatory framework which is providing you investment certainty over the whole duration of the project. And what is specific with renewable, especially wind and solar power, they are very high upfront capital costs. But then when they are in the system, they are just running when the resources is here. So it's all about minimizing capital costs. And minimizing capital costs has mostly to do with exactly this question of investment risk. It's what we measure with the weighted average cost of capital. The reason why renewable projects in Europe typically are low is because one of the reasons, not to do with the resources, it's just because the regulatory framework is so secure that the rate of return expected from the investor is very low, maybe 2 or 3%. In Indonesia, I could imagine, but there you can give us more information, but maybe this rate of return is 10% because of the risk associated to the project. So it really has all to do, I would say, with political commitment that you give long-term targets. So you know that the market will actually scale up. And then very supportive regulation, grid connection, certainty, market integration. And then you have a lot of details to look through. But yeah, to answer short, I will give you these few points.
Okay, thank you so much, Dimitri. Very, very dense answer. So, Dion, I'm going to ask you a little bit. This is an old question about the Just Energy Transition Partnership, JETP. Is there any implementation plan that you could share with us? What's happening in Indonesia with regards to JETP, and how would you relate that to the role of markets as we are in this panel? Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, I think Pak Haris is better suited actually to answer this. But yeah, I'll just talk briefly on JETP itself. So JETP agreement has come to Indonesia between Government of Indonesia and IPG, International Partner Group, in November, and from there we could foresee that there is a target in peaking sector emission, power sector emission by 2030, and also a renewable energy mix of 34%. And this is quite substantial, especially on the second target. Why? Because currently our power system planning only projects like 24% our renewable energy mix by 2025 and 2030. So it's not really increasing between 2025 and 30. And by having this JETP target of 34%, then it's obviously we need more renewables. And I think this comes into the quick fix that probably some of the panelists has mentioned. What Indonesia need to fix is actually the process of procuring renewables itself. So we have actually quite a number of gigawatt in the planning. So from the power system planning of PLN, we have 21 gigawatt until 2030. And for achieving the JETP target, there will be like maybe 6 gigawatt more added to that. So we have 26 gigawatt to be added, and market should play a role to do that. And the first step, I think, is obviously to create a mainstream process for this investment, the procurement process, because all of this has to go through PLN, and they have no experience of doing so, doing a very regular auction with a massive capacity auction, things like that. And now they have to step up this thing, like they have to do this like 4 gigawatts per year, which previously in the previous year they only like need to do like megawatt auction. So this certainly needs the PLN still certainly needs some capacity improvement on that procurement side, and also probably a more certainty on the market itself. And I think for solar itself, we in ISR we have identified one of the key things that probably blocking some of the investment, making it not bankable, is actually the local content requirement to some extent, because we have quite high local content requirement, and I think this has to be relaxed for some times to allow for this this massive investment to renewable energy comes, and then we could adjust the local content requirement back to the current state, along with the support to industry, of course. And this is not just talking about Ministry of Energy, we need to also coordinate with Ministry of Industry at the same time. So I think, and the JETP itself, it's quite clear that the investment plan doesn't really, they don't really limit it to the power system itself, but the industries is allowed to receive this investment mobilization from JETP. So there is actually opportunity for Indonesia to tackle all of these short-term challenges and accelerate the renewable energy development while utilizing this JETP investment. Yeah. Thank you, Michael.
You spoke about barrier, you spoke about opportunity and some recommendations there. I'm going to ask the same of maybe back to you, Ma'am Ning. If it's possible, could you share to us what would be, from this role of markets perspective, one main barrier that you can think of for the Philippines, one main opportunity, and maybe one main recommendation? Ma'am Ning, are you still there with that?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think in all economies, just like the Philippines, one main barrier is for the consumers to assume the true cost of producing this electricity. And that's the reason that we have to be careful with all the policies that we are adopting. In the context, the aspirations of the energy sector should be supported by a concrete plan for improving the socioeconomic conditions of the consumers, such that the component of their expenditures, the electricity component, particularly electricity and for fuel as a basic need, would allow them to have that comfortable life, and that they don't need to reallocate some of their income to the need for fuel and electricity.
Ma'am Ning, and one recommendation, please. Just
recommendation is I think we need to balance the goal, even though we are clear that we want a cleaner environment, a clean earth, but there should be transition such that we recognize that some of the technologies are here to support some of our requirements, and that they should do their share in contributing to that climate goals.
I give 1 minute to Ms. Vu as well. The same thing: main barrier, main opportunity, main recommendation for Vietnam. You're on mute, Ms. Vu. Thank you.
So in my opinion, is the priority barrier. No, not priority barrier. That the biggest barrier for Vietnam, for renewable energy development in Vietnam, is grid intervention, and also leading to the delay of support mechanism. We would like to gain some time to fix the system, because you know, in Southeast Asia country, the grid is isolated. And if the share of renewable energy come in a short time, quicker than the grid, then a lot of curtailment is there. So I think it's the biggest area. However, the Vietnamese government is revising, allowing private investment into the transmission grid. However, more details, more regulation on responsibility of EVN as operator and also investor in terms of technical requirement in terms of responsibility during operation must be further defined. The opportunity here, I think that thanks to the JETB just signed, we can see more access to the financial as well as technical support for the grid issue that Vietnam is facing. Recommendations from my side for the market, you mean?
Yeah, just
Yeah.
any.
Yeah. So I think the key for Vietnam is we have already strategy, we have already vision, but on ground policy, concrete, all kind of mechanism, all kind of regulation for offshore in the future, technology, storage, hydrogen, we still need it. And so I think the key policy for that. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Ms. Vu. I'm going to ask Professor Frank, just maybe 1 minute, like a closing message for our panel, maybe a tip for the region, so to speak.
I will be very brief, in fact, and make that an answer to a question that was on the question and answer elaboration on de-risking mechanisms. And so the principal mechanism in Australia has been these contracts for difference, right, which have the effect of providing a guaranteed price per megawatt hour of wind or solar power delivered by private investors. It's the principal way of de-risking this. With high electricity prices, some governments have actually been earning money from this rather than subsidizing it, right? But the private investors are nevertheless happy because they've got their revenue stream locked in. Also, there's a green bank, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which enters collaborative financing arrangements with private finance providers and oftentimes takes the riskier slice of finance onto its own books and leaves the less risk to deal with in the private financing sector. Thank you very much.
Frank, yeah, okay, I'm passing back the ball. Tarek, thank you very much, panelists. It was a great panel, very good interactions there on the role of markets and transition. So I'm gonna thank you all. I can't give you a round of applause with the crowd, but that's what I'd like to give you even virtually. So Tarek, back to you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Michael, also for your facilitation and really excellent discussion from the panelists and the presenters there. I think there's a lot to chew on, and the connection, I think, between the governance and the market session, those points where they relate to each other are really important for us to consider. Okay, we are entering now the final stages of the session, and one thing we need to do very quickly, it just takes 30 seconds, is an evaluation poll. So Tien, if you just want to do a pass over to you, you can do the poll quickly. So you can see it's, oh yeah, Tien, are you there? You can see the questions have been put up on the screen there, and if everybody could just take 10, 30 seconds or 10, 20 seconds to answer the questions, it'll...
The question is on the screen and the attendees can see.
Okay, just 10 seconds more.
Maybe we could extend a little bit because reading takes time too.
Okay, sorry, yeah. course, we're doing this poll because we want to understand how what works well and how to improve these kinds of sessions in the future as well. And as Sirpa mentioned in the beginning, we're really keen to understand how to, from a sustainability point of view, how to make these things more effective as dialogue sharing, capacity building events. So that's what this is related to. We're starting to get answers for all sessions. About 60% of people have answered, so that's looking pretty good. Okay, I think we don't see many extra answers coming in at this stage. Last 10 seconds, if anybody wants to quickly answer. We will actually have a survey afterwards, so you can still do the survey afterwards if you want to keep answering. But I think in the interest of time, we'll end the poll there. And I think the results of the poll will also be shared with everybody, so you can all see those results as well. So we are a little bit behind schedule. We should be finishing about now, but we've just got two important but small things to finish off. A note to everybody that of course, after this event, we will share the event recording, the presentations. We will be preparing a summary report, and we will try in that summary report to answer all of the other questions that were included in the chat box that we didn't get around to. There are probably a couple of dozen questions in there that we didn't get to answer. So we will try and answer those in the summary report. So look out for that. And if you need any contact, if you need to contact us, then Ms. Tien her email is there, and you can contact through her. Okay. What I might do now is just very quickly, I share my screen if I can do that, Han. And I'll just show you some synthesis from our discussions, so I hope everyone can see my screen. I hope that's showing up clearly. So what I've done is that as people were talking, I tried to kind of collect some of the interesting points and ideas that came up. And I think the first point to share is that on the governance side, that this is sort of a wide-reaching building block. It covers many things, and I think Pak Benny explained these: regulations, policies, institutions, human capacity was mentioned by some of the panelists, investment attractiveness. It's crucial, and it's connected also to governance. And we saw in Pak Benny's presentation that the ASEAN is a big place for energy investments, but a small space for renewable energy investments. And in part, that gap, the panel discussed some of the role of governance in creating that gap. We saw that the implementation of regulations is a challenge. We saw that often the regs come, from a more suitable from fossil fuels and just kind of copy paste it over. We see that national capacity to govern energy projects, which is the institutional building and the human resource building, is not factored into the energy transition process. And we see that some of these technical barriers that were discussed in both sessions, like grid congestion, they're not just technical issues, they also have a governance dimension, which means the supporting mechanisms weren't developed fast enough. And what all this means is the big goal of trying to get some investment into the energy sector is compromised because investors have less confidence when the governance system isn't there in place. We saw some suggestions of solutions as well. So we saw that first that that every country is a different context. Director Hung made that point quite clearly. We saw that a discussion about establishing an individual ministry, that was a recommendation, a dedicated renewable energy ministry, but we saw that each country considers this in that context themselves, and there are different ways. The main aim, of course, is better coordination amongst our ministries, better understanding and awareness also between ministries, but with the public. We saw a recommendation that we have to get better at implementing policies. and that weakness in legislating or implementing policies actually causes a number of issues. And there were questions in the chat that didn't get answered yet, but they related to that exact point about changing legislation later on. We saw countries have strong regulations, some in Vietnam and Philippines on a moratorium on coal. We saw Indonesia is working towards a unified law so that there's one sort of governing framework for all of this. Policy incentives, Director Hung mentioned that these can be useful to catalyze the sector, but then market-based incentives are needed to kind of introduce competition when you're trying to scale. We saw a very important point about making a level playing field that was mentioned not only by Serpa, but also by from a number of people on the just energy transition side, investing in human capital and making it. And an interesting point I think Dr. Lloyd mentioned was making this sort of a national mission that in countries like Germany, the energy transition is very much tied to core government objectives like economic development. So joining those two things together can really make a difference. On the market side, very quickly, we saw a diversity of market models. We saw that the main organizing principle for our markets is how to mobilize investments in renewable energy. We saw that there was a discussion around market reform being a slow and long process, and so that there's often a need to maybe work within the structures we've got if we want to make progress on renewables. But there are difficulties there. So things like contractual inflexibility, lack of short-run price signals can really influence how renewables integrate or scale inside the existing markets structures. We saw that renewable energy as a technology has what Professor Frank described as zero marginal cost, which means that it actually drives down the price in energy markets, and that itself creates new challenges or new opportunities, we can say as well, because that it can push out fossil fuels, as we've seen in Australia, and it can also create the need for new kinds of markets like what Professor Frank was mentioning with ancillary services and batteries and potentially capacity markets. We see in some of these more mature markets a shift towards a more stronger role for state ownership as some of these energy-only problems have evolved, and that. So if we think back from the perspective of the state, then we see that they can also provide oversight and vision to the market. They can provide a longer-term planning horizon, which Mr. Dimitri mentioned was important. They can provide subsidies. They can look at things like contracts for difference, which Professor Frank mentioned, and capacity markets, carbon pricing, control of assets. Important assets may need to come back to state control. They above all should make sure that investments are efficient. So whichever market structure we're in, the investments need to be efficient. They need to remove barriers for entrance into the market from the private sector. And this was mentioned specifically for Philippines about access and permitting, create efficient procurement processes, as Dion mentioned, for Indonesia. And they should try to take on some of the financial risk for clean energy. But as was mentioned by one of the panelists, this is a challenge for ASEAN because many countries look to liberalizing markets as a way to kind of share that risk or decenter government in that risk taking. And I think that's all I will put up there for the summary. Of course, we can't cover everything in the summary, and I'll leave it at that for now. But we will, of course, try and make the report more comprehensive. Professor Frank. I think we've had an excellent set of panel discussions, some really interesting questions. And I think the last thing left to do is to pass to you for some of closing marks and some guidance there at the end.
Well, yes, indeed. What a wonderfully rich conversation we've had. We've had a very large group taking part today, well over 250 participants, a balanced mix from government, civil society, industry, from Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Australia. It's really a wonderful occasion, I think we can say. So our discussion today really highlights the increasing need in our respective countries for capacity building and evidence-based policy, and also importantly for exchange about experiences and approaches between countries. And we certainly hope that this dialogue today, as well as the many engagements last year and coming engagements, have helped with that goal. We certainly look forward to continue our work and potentially extend it also to cover policy-oriented research in this area that is, of course, being conducted, and more of which that could be conducted. So thank you very much to everyone who tuned in, to all of our speakers, panelists, moderators. Really appreciate your contributions, and a special thanks again to our partner organizations. Now, the next event we have under this program will be in the third quarter of this year, and that will be the policy dialogue connected to the COP climate change conference. So please look out for that one and join us then. In the meantime, please connect up with us through the following channels. Firstly, the Southeast Asia Energy Transition Partnership LinkedIn page, a very useful resource, and secondly, to connect with the ANU Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions via Facebook, LinkedIn, or indeed Twitter. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.